Hi everyone, let's continue to study the French defense from Black's point of view. So e4, e6, d4, d5, and here we've already looked at three main moves. We looked at the advance French e5, we looked at the exchange variation e takes d5, and we had a few videos on the Tarrasch variation, which is knight to d2. But perhaps the most pressing move and maybe the most popular amongst grandmasters is knight to c3. So we're going to begin studying this move now. So that move does protect the pawn on e4. The knight is on its natural square. It's influencing the center. It's not obstructing the dark squared bishop. So the only downside to this move is it does invite Black to play the winnower variation with bishop to b4, pinning the knight, and white has to be ready for that. Well, we're not going to play that because it's so theoretical and so complicated. It's very tactical, and it takes a lot of work and study just to keep up with it and to keep your opening lines fresh. So we're going to play more positional. So our choice of move here is knight to f6, which is called the classical variation. So we're pressuring e4 again, and white has to do something about the attack on his pawn. And there are two major moves in the position. E5 will be the subject of our next video. In this video, we'll look at the move bishop to g5. So this is one way that white can deal with the threat on the e4 pawn. He can pin our knight. So if we see this, we're going to play a very interesting line that the Russian Grandmaster Morozevich liked to play a lot. You can find a lot of Morozevich's games in the databases. And the line begins with an exchange on e4. The knight will capture back, of course. And now there's some pressure on f6. So we defend the knight and unpin it with bishop to e7. And so this is a threat to capture the knight on e4 now. So white has to do something here. And typically what he does is, in order not to lose a tempo, white will capture our knight on f6. Now ask yourself, which of the two pieces would you prefer to capture with if you were white? Well, it turns out the overwhelming majority of grandmasters like to capture with the bishop, actually. The reason for this is the knight is very well placed on e4. It's a very strong minor piece, and white would like to maintain it in the center of the board. So he doesn't want to give up the knight, strangely enough. Usually grandmasters are very fond of the bishops and the bishop pair, but here white's going to give up the bishop pair. So before we pursue that any further, let's see what would happen if white did take with the knight. Well, this is a possible way to play, and I did find some games in the database, in the master's database on Lichess, but it turns out it's pretty easy for Black to equalize, and Black has absolutely no trouble in this line. So if you face this, you want to, of course, take back with the bishop, preserving your pawn structure, and then white will generally take our bishop and will recapture with the queen. So our pawns are perfect. White does have a little extra central space, but we've already exchanged two pairs of minor pieces, and it should be pretty easy to develop our queen side, so we're going to have no problems at all. For example, knight f3, we can castle, c3, and now a great way to get the queen side developed is with b6, intending to fianchetto the bishop onto b7. It'll have a nice unobstructed diagonal here through the center of the board. We'll put our knight on d7 to keep it out of the way of that bishop. And also the knight on d7 will help support one of two possible pawn breaks, either c5 or e5, to attack white's center pawn on d4. So there should be no trouble at all developing here and getting enough space, and white is practically dead equal in the position. So it's not a very pressing way for white to play. If white wants to go for an opening advantage in this position, then he should take with the bishop. Now there are two recaptures here, and we're going to follow the Morozevich line, and this is what Morozevich used to play a lot. The very strange, aggressive, unusual G takes f6. So willingly breaking up the pawn structure here, rather than taking with the bishop. What's the point? Well, I think a few things. One is, even though we have doubled pawns, this f6 pawn is useful because we can push it forward to f5 and dislodge that strong central knight. And once we put the pawn on f5, then our bishop sometimes can sneak behind it onto the nice f6 square. So that's one benefit of putting the pawn here. Another is, well, we get an open G file, and maybe that will dissuade white from castling on the king side. So that's not bad either. So we're trying to unbalance the position and get some winning chances, actually. We're trying to play aggressively here. Now, since we have broken apart our king side pawns here, it's very common to castle queen side in the position. So it takes a while, but we're going to try to engineer that, get these pieces out of the way and castle on that side of the board. However, there are some lines where if white doesn't press us too much, we can put the pawn here on f5, the bishop on f6, and castle kingside. That is sometimes very safe. The pawn on f6 can even drop, or the bishop on f6 rather, can even drop back to g7, and it's a very good defender of the king. So it's possible to castle on either side of the board. All right, but our main plan is to try to castle queenside if it goes that way. And the way that's typically done, the way Morozevich used to play this, is he would go for a6 and b5, expanding a little bit on the queen side and getting ready to fianchetto his bishop to b7. Then the knight here can come to d7 and then sneak behind the pawn and go to b6. The queen can go to either d7 or even sometimes to d5. And so all the pieces will get out of the way in this fashion, and then black will be ready to castle on the queen side. And then, as we said, this pawn will likely dislodge the knight on e4. So those are some of the plans in this position. If you remember only that, you can really get started playing this Morozevich line. All right, by far the most popular move here is knight to f3, developing the knight toward the center, supporting the d4 pawn, possibly getting ready to castle kingside, although many times white wants to castle queenside with that half-open g file. And we're going to start our queenside expansion and fianchetto plan right away with a6. That's how Morozevich used to play this. So the intent, remember, is to push on b5, get a little space, control the c4 square, and fianchetto that bishop. That's what we're trying to do here. Okay, so what can white do in this position? Well, we'll take a look at 5 different moves that white can try, 5 of the top moves in the database, and we'll follow at least the beginnings of some grandmaster games, just to give you a flavor for what happens in this type of middle game, or what could happen in this type of middle game. I wouldn't expect anybody to really remember all of the lines, at least not at first until you've practiced it a lot, but this will give you some ideas. So let's begin by looking at a game that Morozevich himself has played in this position as black. His opponent was Christopher Lutz, and we'll pick it up right from here. So Lutz tried c4 in the position. A very sensible move because it counters black's plan of playing pawn to b5. So white's stopping that idea of Morozevich's. So white's gaining some central space. It's got some good control with those pawns. If this knight gets kicked out, it can go behind the c pawn. So that perhaps is maybe the most testing move. It could be considered the main line in the position. So let's see how Morozevich played it. So he began with f5, the knight gets kicked back to c3, and then bishop to f6. As we discussed, that's a pretty good square for that bishop. Queen to d2, getting ready to castle queenside. Okay, and Morozevich switches up his plan since he can't play b5, and he tries to break in the center right away with c5. But white decides to pass by that pawn and pushes d pawn. Let's see what would have happened if he had taken on c5. I think Morozevich probably would have played knight to d7, kept the queens on the board, and pressure the c5 pawn, try to win it back. The queen could even go to a5 to pressure it further. And it's probably a bad idea for white to try to preserve the pawn with something like b4. That just opens the long dark square diagonal here, and it weakens white's position, and the pawns can be attacked anyway with a5. So it's not really a problem if white takes this pawn on c5. But in the game, he pushed forward to d5, and then Morozevich castled kingside. So he didn't go for the queenside castling plan that we mentioned in this particular line. We get opposite side castling, and now bishop to g7. So one of the points of that move is to vacate the square for the queen. The queen can go to f6 in some cases and make a nice battery along the long diagonal. All right, in this position, white played king to b1, which is a subtle move. Let's explain that move, why that was made. I think we can explain it best by looking at an alternative first. What if white tried d takes e6 in the position? Well, then black can take the queens off the board with check, rook can take back, and then bishop takes e6. And black's doing quite well in the position with the bishop pair. I'll point out that it's tempting to maybe play bishop to h6 and pin that rook, but that's actually a blunder. That's a big mistake. The game could proceed with e7, getting this strong passed e-pawn, giving up the exchange like this, forcing rook e8, and then planting this knight beautifully on d5, on this outpost, which is protecting the e7 pawn and threatening to come to c7, forking the rooks if needed. And so white's doing really well by giving up that exchange sacrifice there. So instead, after rook takes d2, black should probably try taking that dangerous pawn right now. And then perhaps knight to g5 to attack the light square bishop. But black should just continue to develop, and if white takes on e6, then he's straightened out the doubled pawns. So black's doing well here, has no trouble at all. So that was a possibility. But instead of taking on e6 right away, we see this move king to b1. And that's actually a preparing move. That prepares for white to take on e6. Because in that line, black taking the queen would not come with a check. That's the whole point of moving the king aside to b1. There would be no check here, which means white would have the in-between move taking on f7 with check, winning a pawn before recapturing the queen. So that's the point of king b1. And Morozevich decided to take on d5 here. And then knight takes d5, knight c6 developing, h4, maybe bringing the h rook to h3 later or h4 later, lifting it. b5, expanding on the queen side, trying to undermine the support of the strong knight on d5. h5, threatening to push it to h6, so black stops that. And now a plan for black is to take on c4 and use the half-open b file to attack that sensitive point on b2. Okay, we see rook to h3 in the game, which I think is at least an inaccuracy, placing that rook right in line with the light squared bishop there. And black takes advantage of that right away and plays f4, revealing an attack on the rook. Okay, giving up the pawn, white decides to give up the exchange and take on f4. Black takes the rook, g takes h3, comes right after that. King h8, I think not really necessary, but black feels his king is safer on h8. Rook d2, trying to support the weak b2 square. This bishop is beautifully pointed at that b2 weakness. Black finally opens the b file. Bishop takes back, then rook to b8. So there's some serious pressure now on the white king. a3, knight a5, attacking the bishop. Bishop drops back to a2. Rook b7 with the idea of maybe putting the rook on, or putting the queen rather on b8, making a battery. Or getting the queen out of the way and putting the other rook on b8, possibly. Queen a4. Queen c8. Okay, that queen was defending the knight on a5, and it no longer is. But the point is, if white takes on a5, which he doesn't do in the game, then queen to f5 check comes, forking the king and the f3 knight. And black gets the piece back, and white's back rank is weak, and black's pieces are very good in this position. So white didn't take the knight. He played knight to f3 instead, stopping the queen from coming to f5, stopping that check. Then rook to b5, defending the knight. Queen e4. Queen b8, making a battery on the b file. Knight d1, giving further defense to b2. Knight b3, attacking the rook. Okay, the bishop exchanges itself. King a2. c4. Notice the c-pawn is immune from capture because the queen is defending the knight on f3. Knight d4, attacking the rook. Rook d8, pinning the knight. Okay. King a1. Let's see what would have happened if white had taken on b3. Let's see. Well, there's queen takes b3 check, king a1, then rook takes d2, and black is just winning. Let's see if white can get a perpetual here. Maybe queen e8 check, king h7, queen e4 check. But then king g8, and next time white checks, the bishop blocks. So there's no perpetual. Black is just winning that line. Okay, so in the game, white tried king a1, rook d3. The rooks get exchanged. There's a double attack on the knight on d4. The knight moves to f5. Queen b3 attacking the knight on the back rank. Okay, queen g4 with a mate threat on g7. So bishop f6 gets out of that threat. Knight takes h6. And rook to b8, putting a third attacker on b2, and white actually resigned. There's no way to defend the b2 point any further. And black's king is strangely quite safe in the open there for the moment. So black is winning and white resigned. Okay, so that was how Morozevich handled that maybe mainline c4 move in this position, stopping that plan of expanding with b5. So let's look at a different move white could play. Let's look at a game. White was Alexandra Kostenyuk, former women's world champion, 12th women's world champion, against Daniel Stellwagen. And in this game, Kostenyuk went for bishop to c4. That's perhaps not the best place to put the bishop because it loses a tempo to black's idea of playing b5, which he does. The bishop falls back to b3. f5 kicks the knight. It goes to g3. And then rather than developing the pieces here on the queen side, which is one idea, black decided to go for this pawn break c5 and threaten the bishop on b3, so threatening to trap that bishop. So white gets an escape square, black gains space, drives the bishop back, then fianchettos the bishop, queen e2 with the idea of castling queenside. I'll point out that castling kingside here is probably a mistake. There's a lot of pressure that black can put on the king side here with this half-open g-file. For example, if white did that, black could try to push this h-pawn forward. Rook to e1, getting a space, a retreat square for the knight. h4, the knight falls back to f1. h3, softening up the light squares on the king side. g3, queen d5 is an excellent move, creating a battery and a threat on the f3 knight. So black has a lot of pressure in the position. I much prefer black after white castled kingside. So queen e2 prepares queenside castling, knight d7, castles queenside, bishop d5, stopping that pawn from advancing. Now that the rook is behind it, white might want to push that forward, so black blockades it. The other rook centralizes, and now black decides he's going for an attack on the white king, even though it castled on the queen side. He already has his pawns well advanced on this side of the board. He feels his king is safe in the center here for the time being and pushes his pawn to b4. The engine actually agrees. Okay, bishop a4, queen a5 attacking the bishop, putting pressure on the pawn behind it. Okay, bishop takes d7, king takes d7, knight comes to the center with check. King moves over to the queen side. He feels safer on that side of the board. He doesn't really care about that pawn on f7. He's attacking the white king. King went to b1. And black starts to open lines here. And there were a lot of mistakes traded back and forth in the game. And black eventually, though, was successful in breaking through and won this game. Let's not see the whole thing, though. Let's move on to another move back in this position. It might not hurt to recap how we get to this position again. Let's just see this classical variation one more time. So we're looking at knight c3. We respond with knight f6. And here we're looking at the move bishop g5 today in this video. So we exchange pawns on e4. We break the pin on the knight and defend it. And now by far the most common capture is with the bishop. And as Morozevich used to play, we're going to take with the g-pawn. Knight f3, a6 with the idea of expanding with b5, fianchettoing the bishop. And so now we'll look at a third option. We already looked at c4, and we looked at bishop c4. Another move that's sometimes played is c3, a little more solid, lending support to the d4 pawn. In fact, Peter Svidler tried this move at least a couple of times and did not do so well in this line. Perhaps it wasn't due to the move c3, though. It was probably due to his follow-up move. So black plays f5. We're looking at a game, Peter Svidler versus Andrei Ryjakov. And Svidler probably should retreat that knight back to d2, but a couple of times he tried posting it on c5. And the engine doesn't like this. It's not terrible, it's not a losing move, but it just gives black a favorable endgame. I think it's hard to see that it is favorable for black. It may take some experience in playing it out, but here's the endgame black can go for. You can take the knight off the board and then exchange queens. Now white does have the d file here, so a good move for black is king to e7. King's perfectly safe right there. There's no need to castle, and that opens up the d8 square for the black rook if it should want to challenge the d file. Okay, but this is the endgame that actually favors black. The engine gives it about -0.7 or so. And I think the reason is white's queenside pawns are much more vulnerable to attack than any of black's pawns are. You can begin attacking with knight to d7, attacking this pawn. And if white decides to defend with b4, then you can start breaking down that pawn structure with a5. And this is what happens in the game. a3 supporting, a takes b4, a takes b4, and then rook to a3 was played to pressure the c3 pawn. White decided, Svidler decided he doesn't really want to protect that pawn and be passive. For example, rook c1, you really don't want to put your rook behind your pawns like that. Black can continue to pressure with knight to f6, and the knight can come forward and attack the c pawn further. Maybe knight d2, knight d5, knight b1 does protect the c pawn, but look at how passive white's arranging his pieces here. Rook to a1 can pin the knight and threaten that c3 pawn further. So that's not the way to play. So there doesn't seem to be a great way to preserve that c3 pawn, which is probably why this is a favorable endgame for black. So Svidler decides to give it up and activate his pieces. He puts his knight in the center of the board. Black takes. King comes up. Rook goes back to a3. Rook a1. Rooks get exchanged. Now white does have the a file, but he has nothing to attack on that side of the board. Black is perfectly safe. Rook d8. King c3. Knight f6. Bishop f3. e5, driving the knight away from the central square. It goes to b5. Then e4 shuts down the light squared bishop. Bishop fell back to e2 in the game. And then knight d5 check, also supporting the c7 pawn. So black is just a clean pawn up. White has no compensation. Black's position is a little bit better, in fact. He has the pawn and the compensation. And black went on to win the game. Okay, a player rated 200 points below Svidler defeated him in this line. All right, so let's go back to this position again and look at another move, a fourth move here that white could try. We're going to look at the game Galkin versus Chabotarev, and Galkin played queen e2. An unusual move, getting ready to castle queenside, but that does block in the light squared bishop here. But I guess maybe white's idea is after castling, he'll have a rook lined up with the black queen. All right, black decided to kick the knight out of the center right away. It falls back to d2. Black goes for this pawn break c5 that we saw earlier in another line. White castles queenside. If white decides to take that pawn, rather than recapturing it with the bishop, I think it's better to play queen a5, and that dissuades white from castling because the a pawn would hang. So black can collect up the pawn on c5 at any time. So white castles long, then black takes on d4, knight b3, so black's going to win the pawn back here, knight c6, knight b takes d4, knights get exchanged. Black gets the queen off of the dangerous d file, puts it on a5, attacks the a2 pawn, so the king moves over to defend it, bishop to d7, queen h5, bishop f6. There's really no danger here to black's king, bishop to e2, castle's long. And this is a double-edged position. I don't think it favors either side necessarily. It's pretty close to dynamically equal. But black did go on to win in this particular position. So black is fighting here. He's got the bishop pointed nicely at the king over here, and black has the bishop pair. He's got the worst pawn structure, but it's a fighting opening. So we won't look at the rest of the game. We're going to look at one more game from this position. This is Gleck versus Nigel Short. So Short has the black pieces here. Now Gleck tries something else. He plays g3 in this position. So his idea is to fianchetto the bishop and actually castle kingside, and hopefully these pawns will prevent any incursion on the g file here. This is actually a very common way for white to play. So Nigel Short plays f5, kicks the knight out of the center, goes back to c3, and then he breaks with c5. All right, and white pushes past with d5. Queen b6 attacks the b2 pawn. Rook b1 defends it. Bishop f6, as we've seen many times, that's where the bishop belongs. Bishop g2 finishing the fianchetto. Both players castle kingside, and then rook d8 lining up with the white queen. Rook e1. Knight c6 is possible. There's a pin on the pawn. Queen c1 breaks the pin and attacks the knight. The knight goes to d4. Nice central square. Knight to e5. Okay, and queen to c7, attacking that knight for a second time, threatening to win it. Knight to c4. And now a lot of tactics here, very difficult position to calculate correctly, but Nigel Short does it in great fashion. He plays b5, opening up the light square diagonal to his rook. So he's actually, in essence, sacrificing an exchange in the position. And white goes for it. He pushes his pawn, attacks the queen and the rook on a8 simultaneously. Queen steps aside to a7. Now there's a couple things under attack here, and white decides to save his knight and centralize it on e5. Let's see what would happen if he goes for the exchange. If he takes the rook, queen can come back and take command of that light square diagonal, and black is actually threatening not only the knight on c4, but he's threatening knight to f3 check, winning the exchange back if he wants it. Knight to d2 does defend the f3 square though, but we can play queen to c6, maybe creating a battery with bishop to b7, queen d1, bishop b7, and f3. So queen goes to d1 to support that. And so white's trying to shut down that diagonal, but black can take the pawn, and black has a pawn for the exchange, and his pieces are great. He's got the two bishops, and the knight has a great outpost on d4. So that would have been how it played out if white accepted that exchange sacrifice. So back to the game, instead, white played knight e5. Bishop b7 doesn't give him another chance to take the rook. Queen h6, it looks menacing, but black has everything under control. He kicks the queen back, then takes the bishop, and takes the pawn on d6, which never really was a threat. Okay, white centralizes his other rook. Queen b7 check, f3 blocks, doubling the rooks, and black has a crushing position. His pieces, all of his pieces are great. His king is perfectly safe, and Nigel Short went on to win this game. All right, so just to recap then, what you should remember about the classical variation, if you want to try this Morozevich line, is in this position, when he takes with the bishop, take back with the pawn. This is how you get your double-edged fighting position. Okay, knight f3, a6, and we saw 5 different responses here by white. Just to give you a flavor of what can happen, c4, c3, we looked at bishop c4, we looked at queen e2, we looked at g3. These are by no means the only possible moves, but we wanted to show you what you're going to be doing in these middle games. This is a common move. If allowed, you can expand on the queen side. We saw this pawn break c5 is very common. So there's a lot of scope for different creative plans in this particular line. All right, thanks for watching.